In contrast to the previous cases, Japan provides a nearly unique instance of a non-Western country that resisted imperialism and followed an independent path to both economic and political modernization and national empowerment in the late 19th and early 20th century. So Japan makes a really interesting counterexample to the cases we've just talked about. In this lecture, we're going to explore the conditions that allowed this to happen. In other words, to examine what made Japan really follow this almost unique role. And we'll look at the evolution of the process itself, while in the next lecture we're going to look at the consequences. That is, what were the consequences of the fact that Japan was able to follow this unique path of independence. So by the early 20th century, what happens, ironically, is that Japan follows the path of the West, that is, an imperialist path. Japan becomes an imperialist, developed industrial power, just like the other Western countries. Not only on par with the Europeans and Americans, but of course directly challenging their control in the world imperialist order. So we'll talk about that next time. The uniqueness of the rise to power among non-Western nations, especially in the 19th century, has meant that historians have given a lot of attention to the question of why. They've looked very closely at the Japanese case. How was Japan, alone among non-Western nations, able to become a world power that could hold her own in a Western-dominated world? And the corollary to this question is, what were the consequences of the fact that Japan did this? That she pushed herself into this Western club of world powers. While Japan resisted imperialist domination, the story still begins with the impact of imperialism in Japan. So we still begin at the same point that we did with the other case studies. As with both China and India, Western imperialism still plays a central role in the Japanese case, but its impact, of course, was completely distinct. To sum up the impact, you could say that there was enough Western presence to anger, frighten, and motivate the Japanese, but not enough to bring them under Western domination, either of the economic or of the political variety. Why was this the case? In the first place, the Japanese government had been successful in keeping the West out until very late in the game. So in other words, the Japanese government had pursued a very isolationist policy that meant there wasn't even that kind of first foothold of trading posts in Japan by the mid-19th century, as you have, of course, in India and China really since the 16th century. Now, it's also true that this isolationism was helped by the fact that Japan didn't have any goods that the West really wanted to buy. So there weren't the silks and the luxury goods, the spices and so on that China and India had that made Western traders really push to get in those countries. So Japan didn't really have anything which invited the presence of Western traders either. So by the mid-19th century, the Western powers have virtually no foothold in Japan. The first foothold comes in 1853, a century after India had been under British control and a decade after the Opium War in China. What happens in 1853 is that a U.S. warship under Commodore Perry sails into Japanese harbor, demanding, under the threat of U.S. military action, that Japan allow herself to be opened to foreign trade. In other words, a familiar kind of scenario. So at gunpoint, Japan is forced to sign a series of infamous unequal treaties. So Japan signs the similar kind of unequal treaty that China had done a few years earlier. So the treaty forced Japan to open 2 of its ports to foreign commerce, which would, as in the Chinese case, be governed by foreign laws and not Japanese laws. In other words, the principles of extraterritoriality, as well as other privileges like fishing rights in Japanese waters, and so on, which followed. But at this point, where we can see the similarities with China, they stop at this point. Because this opening did not lead to Japan's division into economic spheres of influence, as happened in China. Why not? First was what seems like not a very important reason, but it actually was, which is the accident of timing. Thus, soon after the U.S. sails into Japan's harbor, America became involved in its own civil war and then Reconstruction, so its energies were focused elsewhere. So it put expansion into Japanese markets on the back burner. In other words, after the 1853 excursion, the U.S. doesn't really follow up for several decades. So it gives a kind of breathing space for Japan to respond, to figure out how to deal with this new threat. Secondly, in terms of timing, Japan had the benefit of having observed China's experience in the Opium War and seeing what this kind of unequal treaty could lead to and what the demand to open up to free trade could mean. In contrast, of course, when traders had first arrived in China, the Chinese officials really had no idea of what to expect. They didn't see the traders as a threat, but simply as ignorant barbarians who couldn't possibly endanger the great Chinese civilization. So the Japanese had the benefit of hindsight, looking at the Chinese experience. So the accident of timing, then, of the U.S. presence in Japan was perfect. An initial foray in 1853 that kind of got the Japanese awake and mobilized and thinking, followed by a breathing space that allowed them to develop independently if they could. The irony then of imperialist impact in Japan is that instead of leading to foreign domination, it actually was the spark that helped Japan to modernize on her own. So in that sense, it's still very important, but important in a different way than it was in China and India. But still, that's only half the story. Even with these external motives or the external space that's provided for Japan's modernization, it wouldn't have succeeded without the existence of certain economic, social, and political preconditions within Japanese society that put Japan in a better position to industrialize and modernize than either China, India, or Mexico. So there's certain, in other words, internal factors that are important to this equation as well. The first of these internal factors in economic terms is that by the mid-19th century, when the U.S. first arrived, Japan had already completed most of the stages of what we might call pre-industrial development. In other words, they were already poised to go to the next level of industrialization. What does that mean? First, Japan was already a highly urbanized, commercialized society. In fact, it was the most urbanized society in the non-industrial world by that point. And partially because of this, it already had a fairly developed market structure. In other words, it had a structure in which people were producing agriculture for the market, not just for subsistence. They were selling them mostly to the urban consumers, of course. So Japan's economy had many of the preconditions that had been developed earlier already in Europe as well. Urban consumers who were ready to buy industrial goods, established commercial markets, and, importantly, an agricultural surplus that could then be used for industrial investment. You know, the money to develop industry has to come from somewhere. This is really the classic British model. And the Japanese social and economic conditions were already in place for that kind of model to work. It was also helped economically by its size and shape. A small island country which makes it easier to transport goods, to set up communication networks, much easier and cheaper than in huge countries like China and India. There were also, in addition to these economic factors, social factors that made Japan more likely as a setting for modernization. That is, the population was homogeneous and compact. Unlike, of course, both China and India, it's 1/10 of the population of China. Part of the homogeneity is not just that they all live close together, but that you don't have these extremes of wealth and poverty that you had in either China or India. It's a country made up not of starving peasants and rich landlords, but of generally small farmers. And it was a very literate population, comparatively. In the mid-19th century, some 40% of the male adult population can read. as opposed to about 5 to 8% in China. Finally, in terms of the social factors, despite the fact that Japan had kept itself politically and economically isolated, there was a strong tradition of cultural borrowing in Japanese culture that made it psychologically easier for Japan to adopt Western techniques than it was in China. So when they were ready to modernize, it was easier for them to look to the West and say, okay, we can take these ideas and bring them in than in the Chinese context, where the Chinese culture was one in which it was trained to look at outsiders as barbarians. So 19th century Japanese society was full of relatively open debates between Buddhism and Confucianism, for example, with a growing secularization of the upper classes. And there was even a minority of scholars already studying Western science and medicine, especially since the ban on Western books was lifted in 1720. In contrast, again, 19th century China was still one in which scholars emphasized rote learning. There's not the same kind of open debate. And what is being taught is a kind of timeless Confucian model, not open debate about the best route to the future. By the time the Chinese reject Confucianism in the early 20th century, I think it's too late. It's a different moment. But Japan, who had borrowed culturally and mostly from China for hundreds of years, was already more open. It was ready to look at a more successful developmental model and then take what it needed from it. In political terms, here's another level of the precondition. Japan, unlike China, took advantage of the humiliation of the unequal treaty to examine its political system and reform it. Thus, 1853 provokes a political crisis in Japan, which is resolved with what's called the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s. Before 1853, Japan had an essentially feudal government with a figurehead emperor and real power exercised by the shogun, who was the leading samurai warrior of the emperor's Tokugawa clan. The shogun, in turn, delegated power to his daimyo, who were the feudal lords, who then controlled, of course, their autonomous domains like fiefdoms through their own private samurai armies. So this was an essentially feudal political order. What happens after the signing of the unequal treaty in 1853 is that tensions arise over how to respond to this Western challenge. That's the political crisis. The daimyo and the shogun are in favor of simply maintaining the status quo, essentially politically, while some of the lower samurai warriors begin appealing directly to the emperor and argue the need for major reforms. In one plea to the emperor, Kido Koin, a samurai opponent of the shogun, argued that in order for Japan to defend itself against Western imperialism and Western incursions, Japan needed one central national state and one sovereign authority. In other words, he's talking there about a kind of modern central state as opposed to the traditional feudal one. These tensions lead to a virtual civil war in 1866 when the samurai forces defeat the shogunate army with the help of actually imported American weapons from the Civil War. The crisis came to an end with the proclamation of a new emperor called Meiji, or Enlightened One, and thus the term the Meiji Restoration. And this new regime begins to rebuild the state along the lines suggested by the samurai warrior I quoted earlier, Kido Koin. The basic point I want to make here about the restoration is that it opened the way for the kind of modernizing reforms that the Qing dynasty was not able to carry out in China. So for our purposes, the Meiji Restoration is a symbol of Japan's ability to adapt its own political system to the new challenges of the modern world. The result was that Japan was able to establish a modern and independent state that would provide stability and direction for economic modernization. So let me talk a little bit about that process. So building on these favorable circumstances, Japan underwent a dramatic political and economic transformation between the 1860s and the 1920s. Even more remarkable, it was able to do this with a minimum of bloodshed. These two things combined, the speed of the process and the relative smoothness of it and lack of warfare and lack of conflict, puts Japan in a category all of its own in terms of that achievement. And of course, it was able to do all of this while maintaining its own independence and its own identity. At the same time, and here's where the cultural borrowing comes in, this construction was done with a direct eye on Western models in Japan's long tradition. So Kido Koin, who I mentioned before, who after the Meiji Restoration he joins the emperor's staff and becomes an advisor, he returns from an official visit in Europe in 1871 with a full report on the constitutional institutions in what he calls the enlightened countries. So they're actually sending people to Europe to look at what constitutions and constitutional institutions look like there. On the other hand, Japan didn't simply ape the Western model, but borrowed selectively. And there's a nice quote that really illuminates that I want to read by one of the important Meiji politicians who encouraged the emperor to establish a constitutional system in Japan in the 1880s. His name is Okuma Shigenobu, and he expressed this balance as he's looking back at Japan's transformation in 1907. He says, quote, "Japan's general progress during the short space of half a century, that is from the 1860s, has been so sudden and swift that it presents a spectacle rare in the history of the world. This leap forward is the result of the stimulus which the country received on coming into contact with the civilization of Europe and America, and may well, in its broad sense, be regarded as a boon conferred by foreign intercourse." So there he's acknowledging the positive impact of the borrowing. At the same time, he says, Japan is gifted also with a strong retentive power which enables her to preserve and retain all that is good in and about herself. For 20 centuries, the nation has drunk freely of the civilizations of Korea, China, and India, yet we remain today politically unaltered under one imperial house and sovereign that is descended in an unbroken line for a length of time absolutely unexampled in the world. So they have welcomed Occidental civilization while preserving their Oriental civilization. So he expresses here the openness to the outside while retaining a sense of national pride in Japan's own traditions. The first part of the transformation that Okuma refers to in this quote, and now we're looking at exactly what this transformation looked like, was the replacement of an essentially feudal regime with a modern bureaucratized central state. As Koin described such a state, quote, "Everyone in the empire, both great and small, shall be caused to submit to one authority," unquote. In other words, that's basically the liberal principles that come out of the French Revolution, a state in which all institutions, all relationships, and channels of power are regulated according to a uniform set of laws. That's the modern state, a uniform set of laws in which each member of society has the same rights as any other member. In Japan, of course, as had occurred earlier in Europe, this kind of state replaced a feudal one in which people's status depended on their rank in society, in which all of the institutions were regulated by different sorts of complex privileges, right, which changed depending upon who you are and what your status in society was. So all of that is wiped out and replaced by this uniform set of rules in which a samurai is just like another citizen. So in this new centralized state, the fiefdoms, of course, were abolished, as were the daimyo lords, and they were replaced with uniform administrative districts, more like provinces. And each of these provinces had, instead of a daimyo at the head of it, a governor who was, again, more like a delegate of the central government. In addition, they abolished the private samurai armies of the daimyo and established a centralized national army, which again was subject to the emperor rather than to all of these local lords. In addition to this process of modernizing the state, Japan inaugurated a constitution modeled on the German one of 1889, but with a House of Lords on the English model. Many samurai either formed new political parties and competed for seats in the new district assemblies, or they joined the central bureaucracy or the civil service. In other words, the samurai become integrated into the state through taking up positions. They don't become an alienated outside class. The bureaucracy, in turn, was reorganized to insulate it from political and personal appointments. So hiring was controlled through civil service exams. Again, to institute this idea of a uniform set of laws that applies to everybody. In simple terms, then, this political transformation established a state based on uniform laws and rights, including significantly the rights of private property, the principle of equal citizenship and representative government, and the bureaucratic centralization of state power. This modern state then has very important consequences for Japan's economic modernization. So these two things go together. The one is, it's both a parallel and a precondition for each other. In the first place, Japan's modern state created the basic conditions of secure and unrestricted private property that need to be in place for an industrial revolution. And that, again, is the transition from a feudal regime in which private property is not fully recognized and has complicated relationships to a modern liberal regime of private property that encourages, of course, private economic investment. But more importantly, I think in the Japanese case, the strong modern state was able to provide real direction for economic modernization. It played a new kind of role in economic modernization. How did it do this? The government actually got involved by establishing some industries on its own, that is, state-owned industries. It subsidized private industries. It opened a national bank to create low-interest loans, again, to encourage private investment. And it participated in a kind of complicated new way. Just to give you an example, to kind of set out the different models of economic development, in the classic British model, it was, of course, all private investment, right? It was private entrepreneurs that built the railroads in Britain, for example. The other kind of model we've talked about in terms of the railroads is Latin America, where it was foreign capitalists who come in and build the railroads with their investment. In Japan, it's the state that builds the railroads. So the state takes a more active interventionist role. It also, of course, encouraged the formation of a national market through cutting internal tariffs, through regularizing commercial laws, and building national networks of communications, post offices, and so on. It especially pushed the development of heavy industry that would allow it both the economic muscle in trading and the capacity to build a modern army to defend its economic interests. Early on in 1870, Japan established a Ministry of Industry. Again, an early example of this, which both set overall economic policy and operated specific sectors. The result of this state-encouraged industrialization was dramatic. In the decades before World War I, Japan is still playing catch-up. It's exporting large quantities of silk and importing Western technology. So in other words, it hasn't become a fully industrialized country. But by 1914, that dynamic has changed. The shape of Japanese economy looks like Western industrial economies. That is, by 1914, Japan is exporting more industrial goods than it's importing, and it's importing raw materials and primary goods largely from China. So what had taken a century to evolve kind of accidentally in England was built in a few decades in Japan by a government with a kind of clear sense of where it's going in cooperation with private entrepreneurs. And I think this is an important point to emphasize because the English industrial model had been considered the norm up to that point. That is, the model that depended on private enterprise. There was only one other major country at the time in which the government was playing a similarly influential role in stimulating industrialization, and that was Germany. And I think it's no accident that Germany and Japan were both undergoing their process of state formation and industrialization at the same time in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th centuries. For capitalist countries that got a late start, and this was a late start in the 19th century, right, to start in the 1860s and 70s, it was very difficult to catch up to early industrializers like Britain by simply allowing private investment to run its course. So what both Germany and Japan discovered, and what's going to become a new model for successful late industrializers, is that an interventionist government could take the lead and push the process forward quickly, but still within a framework of capitalism and private enterprise. Now, this all sounds impressive, but there was also a darker side to this late industrialization model, which was developed by both Japan and Germany. The flip side of government encouragement of economic development was that it tended to sacrifice democracy for efficiency. To achieve the most efficient implementation of its modernization plans, the Japanese government tolerated higher levels of repression and lower levels of political and labor unrest than in classic liberal models. The process of modernization was fairly peaceful in Japan, but that was partly because the undemocratic state was able to repress a lot of the vocal dissent. So the Japanese regime had adopted many of the liberal principles of efficiency, capitalism, and bureaucracy, and even its representative institutions, its constitutions, but not a commitment to the democratic process. So as many of the Western European and American liberal regimes moved towards democracy in the late 19th and early 20th century, Germany and Japan did not follow this evolution. So how was this Japanese regime undemocratic? Significantly, of course, the Japanese constitutional system was modeled on the German imperial system, established by the authoritarian Bismarck. Thus, the emperor in Japan, as in Germany, conserved significant powers, with the right to veto any bills coming out of the lower house of parliament, and a set of ministers which was responsible to the emperor, not to the parliament. The emperor was also the direct leader of the armed forces, which again were not subject to civilian control. So in other words, the parliament really served an advisory role. It didn't have an equal role with the emperor. Even more undemocratic than the German model, which instituted universal male suffrage, the level of suffrage in Japan was only 5% of adult males who could even vote for that lower house of parliament, which was still only an advisory body. Unfortunately, I think this undemocratic flip side has become part of the late industrialization model of the 20th century as well. Germany was the first European country to pursue modernization in an undemocratic regime, and Japan is the first non-Western nation to do this. Between the two countries, they created a model of modernization which was divorced from the development of democratic institutions. Before then, following the British model, it was assumed, or the American model, it was assumed that economic modernization naturally accompanied the development of democratic institutions, that these two things are somehow linked together. What Japan and Germany demonstrated was that democratic values were not necessarily needed to create a powerful capitalist economy. And this is a lesson that many non-industrialized or developing nations are still following today. And with the slightly different message provided by Stalin in the USSR in the 1930s, their message, of course, was that a country could industrialize without both democracy or capitalism, a different kind of model. Combined with the impact of the Depression, all of these things together undermined what had been assumed links between liberal democracy and economic modernization. Without these links, it would be much harder to make the case for democracy to struggling, developing nations in the 20th century.